Thank you very much. This is the last session of this conference. We all know that the time is really limited, so I'll just go directly to the excellent presentation of three presenters today. So let me very briefly introduce three presenters first. We have Cheng-Chwee Kuik, professor from National University of Malaysia. He's head of Asian Studies, Institute of Malaysian and International Studies. So he came yesterday, leaving tomorrow. So it's a short visit only for this conference. So I really thank him for coming to this conference today. We have Professor Seungjoo Lee, who doesn't actually need any introduction. He's a professor at Chungang University. He also works for the EAI. There is one center which is Technology and Trade Technology and Transformation Research Center at East Asia Institute. The third presenter is Yongshin Kim, who is also a very famous professor from Inha University. So these three presenters will cover the issue of U.S.-China strategic competition related to economic security issues, how Southeast Asian countries respond to this serious competition amid high-tech technology competition. And also, Professor Lee will cover South Korea's perspective, how we try to have a better economic security strategy. And also, Professor Kim will deal with case studies, how South Korea has suffered from economic coercion from China and Japan. So I think these three presentations will make a very good combination of how the economic coercion these days making troubles for Southeast Asian countries and South Korea as well. So let me first invite Dr. Kuik.
Thanks very much, Professor Chen Chee-sung, Mr. Moderator, and also my good friend for your kind introduction. Very good afternoon to everyone. Let me begin by thanking the organizer, EAI, particularly Professor Son, and also his colleagues, his team, for having me here. When Seungjoo, my good friend, contacted me a few weeks ago, his instruction for my task today was very clear, which is that he wants me to provide a Southeast Asian perspective about the very big issue of US-China technological competition. And I have chosen to focus on the 5G issue, mainly because of, as we know, technology competition is quite broad. But there is also another reason why I thought I would choose to do that, because of this is very much part and parcel of a bigger project that Seungjoo, Professor Lee, has been leading over the last 1-2 years. And also because of during that process, the workshop process, I was very fortunate to have Yongshin as a discussant who gave me a series of very good constructive feedback. I've addressed most of them, I think, but clearly I think that there are still some gaps, and I thought this conference, this panel would be a good opportunity for me to present and hopefully to get more feedback later on. So with that in mind, I would do 3 tasks. I would talk about 3 things: about how, about why, and also about the so what issue. That is how Southeast Asian countries responded to US-China 5G competition, why countries are responding rather differently, and also the so what issue. Usually we talk about so what towards the end, but for this panel, for this audience, let me talk about the so what issue so that I would put things in perspective. The so what issue is that although I'm focusing on Southeast Asian states' responses, I think it actually is an important case about middle state responses. Middle states meaning what? Those countries who are sandwiched between US on the one hand and China on the other hand. Middle states refer to those countries who are sandwiched between the two competing powers. Southeast Asia is one set, but clearly there are many other sets of countries. So how and why Southeast Asia responds the way might not be just a matter of Southeast Asia. It clearly offers some kind of parallel observations for other countries as well. So with that in mind, let me quickly talk about the how and also the why issue. The how issue is quite straightforward. We can say that out of 10 ASEAN countries, every single country have responded. There are some overlapping, but there are some differences as well. I think it is also very important, again, for this panel, because of the time limit, to say that there are two very broad responses among the 10 ASEAN countries, two approaches. On the one hand, you can say that Vietnam and Singapore have excluded Huawei in their 5G rollout. But the rest of ASEAN region, the other 8 countries, have adopted rather different approaches. Instead of excluding Huawei, excluding Chinese tech firms, they have actually very openly, receptively engaged and partnered with Huawei in 5G and many other issues. So now to make it in a more thematical way, how best to describe these kind of differences across the ASEAN countries, I would use the term heavy hedging to describe Vietnam and Singapore's approaches of excluding Huawei and Chinese tech firms in their 5G rollout. And I will use the term, the opposite of heavy hedging, in this sense, light hedging, to describe the rest of ASEAN countries. So Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, so on and so forth have adopted light hedging. So you would be wonder, why I use the word heavy hedging and light hedging? For very good reason, not just academic, but policy reasons. Because of, some would say that, I know mainstream kind of commentaries out there have said that because of Vietnam and Singapore have chosen to exclude Huawei, and therefore we can easily, quickly see them as anti-China and pro-US. This is perhaps an easier way to understand, but a wrong one. A wrong one that in Southeast Asia, and we don't have to be citizens in Vietnam and Singapore, to tell us that when Vietnam and Singapore make the choice of excluding Huawei from 5G, they are doing it, they are making that decisions based on their own interest calculation, not because of they are anti-China, not because of they are siding with US in this competition. So this is the first reason why heavy hedging is more useful, to make it clear that the decision of excluding Huawei or part of Vietnam and Singapore is not about the so-called realist style balancing, rejecting Chinese power, siding with the opposite power of United States. That would be too simplistic. Heavy hedging means that, and that distinguish a heavy hedging approach with a light hedging in the sense that both hedges, heavy hedging or light hedging, they see some risk from China, but also the power dynamics. Heavy hedgers are those who see much heavier, darker shades of risk in terms of China. Vietnam and Singapore see a higher risk from the security risk associated with China. And heavy hedgers are also those who are more determined to adopt risk mitigation efforts to counter, to mitigate those perceived risks. Heavy hedgers are also those who are more ready to defy, to say no to China, but doing that selectively. And they are hedgers because of they do things selectively. While emphasizing about Vietnam and Singapore are excluding China from 5G, we should also put things in context in the sense that Vietnam and Singapore only do this selectively. They are not like banning Huawei, they are not banning Chinese tech firms all out. In fact, they still allow, despite the specific exclusion of excluding Huawei from 5G rollouts, is only limited to that particular aspect. On other aspects, even on technology competition, including big data centers, they have actually allowed China and now including Huawei to operate. One good evidence and quick evidence was that if you follow the news, just a few months ago, Singapore had a tender of data centers in Singapore. So the results, 2 went to US backed companies, not surprising there, but also 2 went to China. If Singapore is really kind of like taking a sides approach, Singapore would not have done that, which is why they are kind of doing it selectively. And the examples can go on and on. So now with the remaining time, let me very quickly to move on to the why issue, right? Why, there is a distinction between across the 10 ASEAN countries, where Singapore and Vietnam have chosen a heavy hedger approach, while others like hedging approach. Yeah, and before I move on, elaborate the why, the reasons, issues. I think there are also a number of points that we can highlight. And for those of you who are interested, you're most welcome to go through the text that I shared with the organizers. I think the good way to illustrate, to measure the light hedging versus heavy hedging is to use the 3 indicators in mind. The 3 indicators are indicators of hedging behavior in international relations. The first one is about the active neutrality, actively signaling that we are not taking sides. So Vietnam and Singapore, while making that decision of excluding Huawei from 5G, they keep emphasizing that this is our own decision, our own calculation. It's not about siding with one power over the other. Active neutrality. Not just passively talking about they're neutral, but actively doing so. And the second indicator is about the inclusive diversification. All countries, especially weaker and small countries, want to diversify their partnerships, including digital partnerships, and they do so inclusively. Vietnam and Singapore are the one that exclusive, but as I said, only selective. They only are exclusive in selectively 5G digital insecurity issue. On other things, they still inclusively engage China in e-commerce, in a data center, in many other strategic and also developmental issues. The third and also a final indicator of hedging, and this is so true for heavy hedging and light hedging, is that fallback position. Fallback position of, we know that under uncertainty, risks are multiple and also unpredictable. So you need to have a fallback position of just in case. If things go wrong, you do have some plans B, you have contingency to hold on to. So all heavy hedgers and light hedgers are doing these 3 things. But heavy hedgings are the one that pursue diversification on selective basis. As an indicator, micro level, 5G, specific issue, they exclude China. But on all other issues, Vietnam and Singapore, despite the fact that there are heavy hedgers, they are still trying to include China in one way or another. And this is so not just on economic sectors, it is also true even for security sector. And hence, you are seeing that on ground and over the last few weeks and few months, while Singapore and Vietnam, just like many other regional countries, collaborating with US on security issue, but they are also doing the same. Some say the opposite with China, the very source of security cooperation. Yeah. And finally, the remaining time, let me, as I said, talk about the why. So why explain the hedging approach? Why explain what are the reasons that explain why there was a distinction between heavy hedgers and also light hedger? Why only out of 10 ASEAN countries, only Vietnam and Singapore are pursuing heavy approach of excluding Huawei from their 5G rollout? There are multiple reasons. To cut the long story short, I think the first reason, of course, is the overall threat perception. The more you are more concerned about China, either security threat or political threat, the more reasons that you adopt heavy hedges, because you won't take the risk very lightly. But when your main threat perception is not just about China, you see China as a part of problems, but also part of solution. For many other things that are important for ruling elites, you will be more willing to kind of de-emphasize and also downplay the kind of sources of threat. So that's the first factor. Threat perception vary. Vietnam and Singapore see higher threat about China. digital, but also otherwise, but other countries have a more relaxed and sanguine threat perception. Factor number one. There are also other factors that have to do with domestic. For example, the bureaucracy kind of competency, whether or not that there is an interagency competition, whether or not security establishments, agencies assessment, it's echo and overlap with foreign policy and also other management, it matters a lot. So, and also internal capacity of other different countries at technological level. Vietnam and Singapore are technologically more developed than others. They have options of developing their own homegrown solution. Many other countries have to rely on external. But these two are the main threat perception and also domestic factors are the secondary factors. The primary factor is the third factor, and that will be the final point I will share, is about elite, ruling elites, domestic legitimation. That is a single most important independent variable or the main factor that explains why Singapore and Vietnam have decided to make the trade-off that in order to ensure maximize security, they are willing to forego some economic benefits. And on the other hand, the other light hedges, they cannot forego the economic benefits because economic benefits are central elements to their domestic legitimation. For all countries in Southeast Asia, performance legitimation, to what extent, for how long economic growth, is not an issue of economic issue. It's a political issue. Why is that? Because of all ruling elites, whether democratic countries or authoritarian countries, how they perform economically matters for their sources of political authority and also power, whether or not they can continue to rule. And therefore, they pay attention to developmental economic growth, job creation, and digital connectivity is their priority. And where, in the case of they do not have much other external alternative, they would want to embrace and collaborate with China because it does, China and also Huawei and also a digital Silk Road do provide the kind of economic development and also a prospect that they rely on that will translate into political sources of support. And Vietnam and Singapore finally cannot do that because of domestic concerns push the ruling elites in Vietnam and also Singapore that to take security seriously. In the case of Vietnam, because of anti-China sentiment is very high. And therefore, the identity and legitimation do not allow any ruling elites in Hanoi to relax the security assessment. Singapore is the most interesting one because some say that because of Singapore being an ethnic Chinese majority country, should have more relaxed about the China factor or the rise of China. But in reality, because of the geopolitical context and more importantly, domestic context, we do know that Singapore do not see a rise of China so much as a security threat or economic threat, but more about political cause of concern. Why is that? Singapore elites see China's political or influence operation as the source of political challenges that will affect Singapore's multi-ethnic socio-political fabric. And therefore, Singapore cannot take the security implication associated with China too lightly, and hence the heavy hedging approach. I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. As you can see, there is a very profound and developed theory of hedging in this presentation because Professor Kuik has developed a very good theory of hedging so far. In South Korea, there is a tendency to view hedging as hesitating, as a very passive reaction to great powers' rivalry, but he interprets hedging as a very active policy with delicate balance from policymakers' perspective. So there are a lot of lessons that we can learn from Southeast Asian cases. One of my question is, if there is a different kinds of hedging among the South Asian countries, can China exploit these differences among these countries, such as driving a wedge between these countries, harm, erode the ASEAN centrality? So if you have time, please let me know. And then I will invite Professor Lee for South Korea case.
Yeah, thank you, Professor John. Looking around, actually, I find that there is no female speaker in this panel. Actually, like up to the session 3s, we had pretty much like a gender equal sessions. So I, as a member of the organizing committee for this conference, I have a kind of the guilty feeling for not having a female speaker in this panel. But I'll have to tell you that the EAI does respect and support gender equality, and then maybe next time we will try to recruit the female speakers for this session. Actually, in a sense, my paper is kind of complementary to Cheng-Chwee's paper. Actually, Cheng-Chwee is mostly interested in looking into the differences between Southeast Asian countries in terms of economic security strategy. But my paper is more about the similarities and differences across time in terms of South Korea's economic security. So in that regard, I think our papers are quite complementary to each other. Having said that, I would say that the economic security has become a buzzword for the last several years, and a couple of factors that contributed to the emergence of the economic security in major countries. I can name a few factors. Like first of all, the U.S.-China strategic competition is one of the defining factors that prompted not just the United States but also China and other countries to rush to the economic security strategy. Particularly, the Trump administration actually try to identify China's unfair trading practices and define them as economic aggression, which they believe will pose a threat to the U.S. national security. So there is a linkage between national security and economic security. And also, global spread of the COVID-19 is another factor that prompted the emergence of economic security worldwide. Actually, because of the spread of the COVID-19, the uncertainty in world economic order has rapidly increased for the last several years, and also prompted the proliferation of the nationalism and protectionism. So the great deal number of countries were very much interested in promoting and pursuing their own national interest at the expense of others. And also, in the wake of the COVID-19, actually the number of countries actually experienced the so-called supply chain disruptions. And then at the company level as well as the national level, a lot of countries and companies try to embrace the so-called just-in-case paradigm, departing away from the just-in-case or just-in-time paradigm, which highlights the security implication of the supply chain disruptions. So against this backdrop, I would say that many countries try to attempt to create their own economic security strategy to safeguard their own national interest. So in that regard, I would say Korea is not an exception at all. But however, looking closely, so actually Korea's move to the economic security strategy is far from a recent phenomena. Rather, I would say from a long-term perspective, the origin of South Korea's economic security strategy dates back to the early 1960s. In that regard, I can find the both similarities on the one hand and the differences on the other hand in terms of the evolution of South Korea's economic security strategy. So let me move on to the similarities or continuity in South Korea's economic security strategy. The first feature, predominant feature in terms of continuity is the reactiveness of the South Korea's economic security strategy. In the traditional economic security strategy, actually South Korea took a very cautious approach to economic sanctions. Of course, South Korea joined forces in participating in the economic sanctions, but primarily at the multilateral level. And in that regard, the economic sanctions has never taken a central role in the South Korea's economic security strategy. In that regard, I think this kind of feature has continued to exist in the nowadays, as South Korea is more interested in responding or reacting to the economic coercive measures from great powers such as China and Japan. So in that regard, the reactive nature of the South Korea's economic security strategy it has been a predominant feature of the South Korea's economic security strategy for the 5 to 6 decades. Another predominant feature is that the mercantilist nature. Actually, from the outset, in the 1960s, South Korean government ambitiously launched its own industrialization strategy, as demonstrated by the export-oriented industrialization. Actually, in that regard, one may argue that South Korea's industrialization strategy has the kind of the pretty much liberal nature, but because South Korea actively try to integrate itself into the world economy and try to liberalize trade policies. But at the same time, I would say South Korea's industrialization strategy as well as trade policy does have a very mercantilist nature because it specifically set the goal of catching up with the advanced countries. And also, South Korea tried to liberalize its trade, but at the same time, it tried to liberalize only on a selective basis to promote and nurture the export-oriented industries. In that regard, the mercantilist nature is kind of built into the South Korea's economic security strategy, and then that nature still continues nowadays. And the third feature of the South Korea's economic security strategy is that the combination of geo-economic as well as geopolitical responses. Again, dating back to the 1960s, South Korea's industrialization strategy was basically geo-economic responses to geo-economic challenges. Actually, at that time, the Korean government conceptualized that South Korea is under mounting pressure as a late developer to catch up with the advanced countries. And on the other hand, South Korea is also sandwiched where late developer try to catch up with South Korea on the basis of the cheap labor cost. In that regard, South Korea was in a kind of a sandwich position between advanced and late developing countries. In that regard, South Korea tries to meet with the geopolitical challenges with the geopolitical responses. At the same time, South Korea, in order to meet the geopolitical challenges, had to come up with the so-called industrial upgrading strategy. But on the other hand, it is also a response to the geopolitical risks, particularly given that coming into the 1970s, South Korea was under mounting security pressure from North Korea. In that regard, South Korea tried to upgrade its own industrial structure to nurture defense-related industries. So on the one hand, it was an industrial deepening strategy, which is geopolitical responses. On the other hand, it was a national security strategy, which is designed to meet the geopolitical risks. So having said that, I also would like to highlight the changing nature of the South Korea's economic security strategy. In this regard, I would say the visibility of technology, particularly high technology, has substantially increased in South Korea's economic security strategy. And then, actually, high technology took the central stage in terms of the South Korea's economic security strategy. Why? I think first has to do with the impact of the US-China strategic competition. As is well known, the US-China strategic competition started out as a trade war between the two countries in 2018. And quickly, both countries tried to move the stage of the competition to high technology areas. Right? So in that regard, South Korea was forced to adopt the high technology as a means to deal with that kind of strategic challenges. In that regard, the visibility of high technology has become substantially increased for the last several years in terms of the South Korea's economic security strategy. And also, South Korea paid attention to the high technology as a nexus between the economy and security. Actually, a lot of experts and scholars talk about the linkages between the economy and security. But in order to effectively link the two, the economy and the security, you need a nexus, right? And the high technology is one of the nexus that can link effectively the economy and security. But as you know, South Korea is one of the few countries in the world with the capacity of the high technology. So it is kind of the natural conclusion from the perspective of the South Korean government to take advantage of high-tech capability and incorporate those capability into the South Korea's economic security strategy. So I would say that is the kind of the new feature of the South Korea's economic security strategy. And the third one is that South Korea has made a lot of efforts to boost so-called tech sovereignty. As is well known in the cases of the South Korea's attempt to increase the competitiveness of the materials, parts, and equipment. Actually, in a sense, South Korea, in that regard, has been in transition for the last couple of years in terms of the economic security strategy. On the one hand, boosting the competitiveness of the parts, materials, and equipment is a kind of reactive measures designed to deal with the economic coercive measures from China and Japan. But on the other hand, I would say it is at the same time a preemptive measure in order to remedy the structural vulnerabilities of the South Korean high-tech industries, particularly supply chains. And then it may be useful to prevent another occurrence of the economic coercive measures from other countries such as China and Japan. And the last feature, new feature of the South Korea's new economic security strategy is that South Korea tried to take advantage of high technology as a bargaining leverage to induce international cooperation. As I told you in the beginning of my presentation, this is the age of the nationalism and the protectionism. So many countries are actually so much interested in pursuing their own interest at the expense of other countries, right? So in this age, actually not many countries are interested in pursuing international cooperation for the sake of international cooperation, right? So in order to induce international cooperation from other countries, you need to have some assets, such as high technology capability. So South Korea is one of the countries that has that kind of capability. So that's one of the reasons why South Korea tries to take advantage of high technology competitiveness as a means to induce international cooperation from other countries, such as the United States, Japan, and the United Kingdom as Netherlands. So that is another new emerging feature of the South Korea's economic security strategy. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. He gave us a very good picture of the evolution of South Korea's economic security strategy. Last week there was a Korea-China trade conference, right? And then there was a discussion about supply chain cooperation. I think it's very hard in the area of high tech. So can we adopt hedging strategy, as Yongshin said, to offset the risk? Because US is pursuing very strict high-tech export control, probably with South Korea. So do you see any possibility that we can pursue a harmonious policy toward China? And then let me invite Professor Kim, please.
All right. First of all, I'd like to thank to the President Seungjoo of the President Seungjoo, which invite me to this wonderful conference, and Professor Chun Jae-sung also thanks for the moderating this great session. First of all, this paper is about it's kind of like the initial case study on the South Korea's experiences of economic coercion from China and Japan. Right now, at the G7 level or EU level, the multilateral level, the many countries try to make kind of like the effective ways, or try to find the effective ways to prevent or deter the China's economic coercions. So by taking care of, seeing the Korean case seriously, I hope that I can contribute a little bit about the developing the effective ways of the to deter the economic coercions. So first of all, like actually, the China has been the recipient of economic sanctions by Western countries until the China's open up and reform in 1978. But recently, China started to use the economic coercion more frequently to achieve its political and diplomatic goals. And according to the different studies, the number of the economic coercion has been changed, but the MERICS, which is the German institute, identified about like 123 coercive cases between 2010 and 2022, and the Australian organization also identified the similar numbers of the happening of the Chinese economic coercions. Then, even though actually there is no consensus about the definition of the economic coercion, but at least we can say that economic coercion is the using economic means to achieve political goals, and economic means include the exploiting the economic vulnerabilities and dependencies through trade, investment, and foreign aid measures. So, in terms of the countermeasures from the target countries, actually the Victor Cha recently identified 4 different types of the countermeasures. The first one was the kind of like prioritizing economic security and developing capabilities to detect disruptions in advance. And the second countermeasures might be adopting the trade diversification, along with the strengthening domestic capabilities or like the localization if possible. And the third countermeasures is the relocating their core sourcing and production chains by using the reshoring or the friendshoring. And finally, the target countries can also use the kind of like the mitigation tools which can adequately support which can adequately grant the monetary assistance to the firms or the entities who are sanctioned by the economic coercions. So in table 1, actually, I tried to make the comparison between the economic coercion from China and Japan towards South Korea. And by identifying that kind of the differences, I'd like to trace what kind of factors, or I'd like to answer that why do target countries such as South Korea use different tools as a countermeasures to economic coercions. So the first factor is, we can say that the formality. So in terms of the formality, the Chinese economic sanction has been very informal, but in Japanese case, it has been much more formal ways. So the Japanese government actually imposed the export control on the 3 critical materials, and also excluded the South Korea from the white list. And in terms of the scope of sanctions, the Chinese coercion was much more comprehensive. So it started from the banning of the K-culture products or K-culture performances in Chinese territory, and it's a kind of like controversial, but the EV batteries which is produced in Chinese territory by the Korean companies were not eligible to getting the subsidies from the Chinese government, and it expanded to the retail sections such as the Lotte Mart and the Lotte department stores, and it also expanded to the tourism. But in terms of the scope of sanctions, the Japanese the economic coercion was much more kept in the very small yard. So it has been mainly targeting the 3 important materials which directly related to the semiconductor and display sectors. And in terms of the strategic importance of targeted industries, the Chinese targeted industry has the much lower the importances or strategic importance compared to the Japanese targeted industries, which is directly related to semiconductor and the display sectors. And in terms of the scope of the targeted firms, actually, the Chinese coercive case shows that it is mainly targeted at one firm, the Lotte, in the retail industry, and the many small and medium enterprises in the tourism industries. But in Japanese cases, actually, the entire value chain of semiconductor and display sector was targeted by the Japanese the economic coercions. So If I summarize the result of the economic coercion from China and Japan, actually we can say that the Chinese economic sanction or the economic coercion has been informal, and it was more like kind of like a comprehensive, the carpet bombing coercion against the relatively low strategic sanctions. And even though actually it caused a huge loss of the economic huge loss of the about like estimated 0.5% of the Korea's GDP. So it made huge scars in terms of economic economic ways. But Korea's countermeasures are mainly it was mainly about the mitigation measures. So there was no explicit or the prompt compensation to Lotte, and the Chinese economic coercion actually did not change the policy trajectory of the deployment of THAAD, but left the deep scars in the bilateral the relationship. And if we summarize the Japanese case study, actually it was much more like the clear, and then the Japanese government took the kind of like official means of the coercion, and the targeted sanction was kept in the more like the small yard, and the targeted sectors was much more highly strategic important sectors. From the Korean the reaction or the countermeasures, the Korean government very promptly utilized kind of like centralized response to the centralized response. So the Korean government made the policy tools to localize the three materials and try to help the companies to diversify the sourcing targeted materials. And actually, even the Japanese the economic coercion also failed to change the Supreme Court's ruling. So the Japanese government could not achieve its short-term goal, but the Japanese demands were reflected when the new President Yoon Suk-yeol came into power. So by summarizing these two case studies, I can draw kind of like two theoretical implications. So first one is as seen in the two case studies of economic coercion from China and Japan. It is not easy to achieve the political purpose of economic coercion in the short term. So in situations of economic coercion, the target country tend to prepare countermeasures appropriate to the situation and is not willing to easily comprise with the political demands of the coercive country. So ultimately, considering the difficulties in discussing building collective resilience based on the deterrence by punishment amid various discussions on China's economic coercion, an approach based on the deterrence by denial also needs to be actively considered. So deterrence by denial means actually, or this aims to prevent an adversary from taking an unwanted action, not through fear of punishment, but rather through a fear of failures. So making public China's economic coercion has a poor track record, or the poor track record, and maximizing the reputation and the economic cost of the maneuvering economic coercion is not the perfect one, but it can be a kind of like a very low-cost deterrence strategy we can use as a collectively. And the second, in the long run, actually, the policy change in the target country is only possible usually through the operation of internal interest groups. So it's kind of like the Hershmanic logic that increased economic interdependence can create a new interest group in other country that can exert political pressure on the government. And these kind of things can equally applicable to the situation of the weaponization of economic interdependence or the weaponization of the economic coercions. So from the long perspective, it is advantageous for economic coercion to be targeted rather than a carpet bomb to expect interest group to play a role in the target countries. So after all, so in order to win the hearts and minds of interest groups in a target country, the disciplined, formalized, and precise coercion can have some effect or might have better effect in the long run. I'll stop in here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. He gave us a very good comparative case studies about two coercion case. I suddenly wonder if there is any case in which China accepted it as a Coercion? Is there anyone? If not, why? Now we have three excellent discussants. The first discussant is Professor Lee Wang-hee from Aj University, and Professor Lee Yong-wook from Korea University, and Professor Sahashi Ryo from University of Tokyo. He's now currently a visiting professor to Seoul National University. I think you are a designated discussant, but you may want to cross comments on other papers as well, especially if Professor Sahashi has something to tell about Japanese case of coercion on South Korea. I think it will be interesting if you want to. Now, let me invite Professor Lee Wang-hee.
Thank you, Professor John. Yeah. Actually, as a discussant, I am supposed to criticize Professor Kuik's presentation. But frankly speaking, I do not have found any major mistake, error, or fault. Actually, his analysis is very excellent. His argument is clear-cut, and there are many good evidence to support his argument. This is why I do not need to summarize his presentation as well. Rather, I would raise a couple of questions that are related to the hedging strategy. My first question is about the Huawei. Actually, there are many controversies about the Huawei's telecom equipment. But how about Huawei mobile phone? Is there any difference between Huawei telecom equipment and Huawei mobile phone? Actually, as far as I know, Huawei and other Chinese mobile phone from Oppo, Vivo, and Xiaomi is quite popular in many Southeast Asian countries. And my second question is about the role of the United States. It's a hedging strategy is taken, in the context of the U.S.-China strategic competition. But this analysis is only focused on the Chinese perspective. But how about the role of the United States? I think that if America can provide an alternative to Huawei, telecom equipment, the Southeast Asian countries would choose a different, options or different project. In that sense, I think the Belt and Road Initiative is not the best option from a perspective of the Southeast Asian country, but can be a second best option. Why? Because America has no alternative to the Chinese initiative. And my third question is about the domestic politics. Actually, in many South Asian countries, is a democracy, and in a normal democracy, regime change tends to a policy shift. Probably, in the countries, you analyze, there'll be many, policy shift, I suppose. You mentioned fallback options. Is there any country, changing, the shift their policy, during the 5G project? Yeah. This is my third question. And my final question is about the Korean case. I think the Korean government exclude, Huawei telecom equipment gradually and very quietly, not to make a trouble with China. If this is the case, I would, classify the Korean case as a light hedging. What do you think about my assessment? But I think that, Professor Seungjoo Lee also, can reply my final question. Thank you.
Am I right? Okay. Okay. I'm Yongshin, and I thank organizer for inviting me to be a discussant for this wonderful panel and Professor Lee's paper. Professor Lee's paper is really pleasant to read, and indeed, paper does do I think a great service to those of us who are interested in evolution of South Korea's economic security strategies over the last 60 years. In other words, quite a few works have recently attempted to analyze the nature of South Korea's economic security policy, but none of them seems to be so successful to accomplish the task. So in my view, Professor Lee's paper offers much needed comprehensive and systematic account of it, and with the case of South Korea's high technology policies, the paper does that by identifying, as he mentioned already in his presentation, four key features of South Korea's economic security policy. They are countering economic coercion, mitigating structural vulnerabilities, strengthening tech sovereignty, and finally, inducing international cooperation. So as much as I like this paper, I was in trouble when I prepare my comments. It is simply because I might have nothing to say as a discussion to my embarrassment. So last night, I squeezed myself and squeezed the paper to say a few things about it. So I have three comments and suggestions as a result, okay? So my first comment is on supplying some conceptual definitions of economic security and geoeconomics early on in this paper. Both concepts are central to this paper, but our scholarly community has not yet reached agreements on what they exactly mean and how we operationalize them. As such, offering working definition of these two terms would give readers much easier time to follow the paper's analysis, including such an expression as economic security strategy responding to geoeconomic challenges on page 3. So relatedly, the concept of tactical linkages and substantive linkages are usefully suggested early on as two modes of economic security linkages, but they are rarely reconnected to a subsequent discussion. So I suggest that the paper might need a tighter linkage between these two concepts and the following empirical analysis. That's my first comment. And second comment is concerned with the question of where the four features of South Korea's economic securities are directed at. In current form, countering economic coercion, mitigating structural vulnerabilities, strengthening tech sovereignty, and finally inducing international cooperation are all directed against China. So I do understand this formulation in the midst of a US-China strategy competition, but at the same time, there are some aspects of South Korean economic security in critical tension with US policies. Therefore, I think some adjustment is needed in this regard when the paper is to be revised. My final comment is about the organization of the paper. In the third section of the paper, entitled High Technology as Nexus Between Economy and Security, subsection entitled Securing Industrial Policy Technology Innovation Nexus, in my view, needs to be moved up into introduction of the paper. It is simply because a subsection deals mainly with conceptual distinction between traditional industrial policies and economic security strategies. So I'm not sure if my comments make any meaningful suggestion to the future of the paper, but I look forward to reading fuller version of the paper or book shortly. Thank you. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me, EAI. This is my great pleasure to read all three papers in advance. But I'm a designated commentator to discussant for Professor Kim Yongshin. But before going to my comment to Professor Kim, let me just pose just one question to each previous speakers. First to my friend Cheng-Chwee. I really love your paper, of course, as usual. But my just one small question is, because as a two speaker today, discuss about economic coercion. So economic coercion. So I think we understand your perspective on hedging. But if some country, especially light hedging countries, got strong economic coercion, could they really maintain their position? This is just my small question, but this is a little bit different angle to discuss about economic hedging in economic security. And my small question to Professor Lee. So I really, of course, as usual, enlightened by your papers, but in the very last part, you discussed high technology as a leverage for international cooperation. I'm, of course, as my previous discussant say, this is really excellent point, but my question is, yes, we have to do it. We have to try to use high technology as a leverage, but by what mechanism we can do? So this is just another very small question to you. So to Professor Kim, I really love your paper, but before going to the detail, just let me put economic coercion in a bigger context. Because everybody started to discuss economic security recent years. But as Professor Lee said, we don't have any particular definition. So I recently picked up what kind of areas we have to discuss in economic security. And I recently prepared one slide, and it has 20 areas in economic security, starting from like critical mineral management, infrastructure management, supply chain, patent management, security clearance, export control, semiconductor policy, industrial security, cyber security, human rights due diligence, data security, international standardization, fighting against disinformation, and economic coercion. So I think, but even though we have to admit economic coercion is one very important part of economic security, but we, every countries have to make preparation for each areas. So this is a really big challenge for us now. Especially data security will come up very soon as a very, important areas, and we have to make our domestic law, enhance our domestic law and preparation for that. But having said that, economic coercion is, again, very important topics now, and G7 countries, of course, including Korea as invited guest this year, made a really big achievement this year's Hiroshima summit. And they discuss how to deter, they use the word deter, how they use deterrence against economic coercion. So G7 countries are now very busy in discussing the new economic coercion, anti-economic coercion platform. I don't know still what kind of things they really will create. Deterrence by denial, deterrence by punishment, we don't know. But maybe because some countries, actually including Japan, attempt to include some aspect of punishment. So the new mechanism might have some, deterrence by punishment scheme, but the main focus might be deterrence by denial. But anyway, so many countries start to discuss, including G7, but also EU. EU recently published a new economic security strategy, but they discuss EU's way, ACI, against economic coercion. Japanese government also is said to publish a new economic security strategy report or something, but I don't have any particular information on that at this moment. But every country has big interest and preparation on economic coercion, and the reason why, especially Japan, are now very serious about that is we are now having economic coercion from China after Japanese government decision to dispose Alps water from Fukushima area to Pacific Sea. to the Pacific. But anyway, so now it is very important for us to discuss about economic coercion. We know that very well. So let me just give some questions and comments to papers, and really important papers. But I think first of all, we have to distinguish the Chinese way and Japanese way. But before going to that, even though I said Japanese way, we only had one case. But unfortunately, that was against your country. I'm very sorry for that. And Prime Minister Abe, actually, he left before assassination. Actually, after assassination, this is published. But before assassination, he left interview. And that book is published already. And he admitted he wanted to use economic coercion against Korea because of political reason. Not, export control, whitelisting is just a, kind of bureaucratic reasoning, right? So we know that very well now after his interview published. But don't take us wrong, because that was only one very exceptional case, right? And Japan's case was also very exceptional because Japan's case we use our export to Korea as our tools, but in China's case, they normally use import as a tool, right? Of course, in Korea case, it is more complicated because they also use other methods like, they even, try to punish Lotte and other companies in China by other legal measures. But in most cases, China tried to use their power to buy from other country. In Japan's case, Japan government tried to use a power to export, to sell important goods. So I think this is very important, for us to take a note, right? And in the future, we will see more and more economic coercion from China, not Japan. Don't take me wrong again, right? But I really don't think Japan government will repeat the same mistakes. But China will make the same mistakes again and again in the future, even though we know economic coercion in most cases failed, to satisfy their political and diplomatic objectives. So we really have to distinguish Japan's case and Chinese case. And for Chinese case, their power to purchase or invest is the source of the power. We have to take note of that. And another comment to Professor Kim's paper is, even though you pick up 4 areas or 4 factors, to distinguish Japan's case and the Chinese case, but I think another important factor is ambiguity. Because the success of China and failure of Japan is really up to Korea didn't know how much and by when, until when the sanction would take place, right? So, and they are always very ambiguous and also in scope of sanction. So ambiguity was very important to make a big success in economic coercion. So, we, as a target country, so how can we, make a countermeasure against China if they do this strategy very well, keeping ambiguity, right? So I think that still, I believe, what we really have to do is to team up all of the country, like including South Korea, Japan, United States, and Australia, and other countries. But my final comment is United States is not very reliable in economic coercion. They always admit that. They always say we cannot let market access for many times, right? They try to limit market access, even though their allies are targeted. So I think, we really have to rescue ourselves, among allies and partners. So for that sake, I think, we have to know, what is China's strategy. But again, my point is China's strategy or China's use of economic coercion is always very ambiguous. We don't know what is the real political aims. We don't know next to which area they will employ economic coercion. So this is my last comment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for excellent discussion. We have some time, but I think if you listen to the answers from the presenters, we may be short of time. So let me collect questions from the floor if you have. So if you have any questions or comments to presenters or discussants.
One question for the panel. The unpredictability was mentioned by a couple of you within American domestic politics, and what that does to any sort of strategy, hedging, light or heavy, balancing, soft balancing, any of these things. It all seems to have been based, at least normally in most of the work on Asian security, on a degree of stability and predictability in US foreign policy behavior. And that's been thrown out the window. And I just wonder, both in terms of our academic work, but also in terms of policy making, what you do with that. If you have a solution, let me know. Thank you.
That's the question that we'll face after 1 year from now on. So Cheng-Chwee, please.
All right. Thanks very much. I think I have a question or questions from Chae-Sung, from Professor Lee, and my friend Ryo Sahashi. And then I think I can relate to what Alan, if I may, the very, I would say, spot on issue of unpredictability. I think in IR, among IR community, among IR literature, we do use the word uncertainty a lot, and that's, I guess, interchangeably with unpredictability. So if I can respond and then also relate to all other questions that were posed to me, is that I think that is the mother of everything, right? Uncertainty. It's certainly the most important factor for hedging behavior, because we can say that if things are certain, there is no need to hedge. Make your decision. Either you want to align with US completely, or you align completely with China. If you align completely with US, we call it as kind of like a straightforward decision. Same with bandwagoning with China can be straightforward. But at the moment, because of uncertainty about two conditions, states, especially in Southeast Asia, but also beyond, have decided to hedge. Until and unless that two conditions become more certain, hedging behavior, however imperfect, impermanent, will continue in one way or another. And also bear in mind that my favorite saying, hedging is often a policy without pronouncement, meaning that countries hedge without saying and telling the whole world that, hey, we are hedging, right? Because they would defeat the purpose. So with that, what are the two conditions that allow me to relate, to respond back? So two conditions, one is about threat perception. The other one is about aligned support. If you know exactly who is your number one threat across the board, black and white, if you are in a black and white situation, no room for hedging. You make decision. If you see that China across the board threat, risk in economic, insecurity, and political, and you know for certain you can count on US to lend the support that you need, no need to hedge. You just make the decision. No hedging. But you are uncertain about both threat and also both the aligned support, you will say that let's do what we have been saying in daily context, right? Let's not put all eggs in one basket. That's what hedging in layman term, right? You don't burn the bridge. Keep the options open, because you will never know. Things are uncertain. And US was mentioned. You were referring to the domestic context. I think countries in Asia particularly, I think US allies and partners are even more nervous. Everybody is nervous. Allies and partners are even more nervous because of Trump might come back, right? That is the largest uncertainty domestically for US, but externally for all of us, all countries, right? So something beyond our control, but it does affect us, because it does affect that to what extent and for how long. We can count on a US or US cut to counterbalance whatever threat assessment, right? So that I hope by that I answer the very fact that, and that allowed me to relate to Rio's question of whether or not the hedging, whether light or heavy, will last forever, right? Nothing lasts forever, right? Nothing lasts forever since we are in Korea. very plainly, and that relate to Professor Lee. I think I agree with you. Korea seems to be light hedging rather than heavy hedging. Light hedging, as I said, are those that see heavy hedging are those that who see risk in a darker shades, very seriously, very nervous, and are more determined to take actions to counter, check, mitigate the risk, and more ready, more open to review that kind of concern, right? To define even the sources. So from how we see in Southeast Asia, we thought South Korea's policy has been shifting quite a bit from Moon to Yuan. Moon, it's a very light hedging. Yuan seems to be like much heavier, if not already balancing, but much heavier in the sense that earlier on, for example, South China Sea, South Korea keep distance, right? You are concerned about that, but you don't really want to make it very open. Same with Taiwan, but these are all kind of like shifting, so on and so forth. So I think the best way to respond to that would be to relate to the certainty issue. Certainty about the aligned support and certainty about the threat perception, right? So nothing is lasts forever, but when conditions change, countries evolve accordingly. South Korea is one example. Another example would be Vietnam, right? And also Philippines. Philippines from Duterte to current Bongbong, you see that it's like hedging to heavy hedging, if not already balancing, right? And why is that? Threat perception change. China's action, it is a source of issues. And then again, US factor is another issue, right? The real test will be next year, if and when Trump does come back. Let's see to what extent and how many countries' policy will be shifting again. That will be a real test to see whether the so-called hedging theory of saying that threat perception and also allied support that will be the primary one. So with that, let me very quickly turn to the issue of waging, right? Perfect. Choi Sung is always spot on, right? In IR literature, we also say that small states hedge, big powers wage, right? So hedge and wage sounds very similar, but it's very different depending on where you see, whether you are small countries or you are big powers. Small countries, because of you are much more weaker and smaller, you are more vulnerable. You will be more affected by uncertainty and also their implications. You know that you need to be cautious. Big power, because of capability, superiority. You can do a lot of things. Not everything, but a lot of things. So it's natural for big powers to wage whenever possible. And China is not the only big power that have the tendency to do that, right? But to relate your question, to respond to your question, I would say that we need to make distinction between two kinds of scenarios. One scenario, China definitely is exploiting the differences across smaller countries in Southeast Asia, but it's not always the case. There are also cases where you do see that China might want to wage, but cannot do that. So what are the two type of cases? One is cases where involve collective action as a group. ASEAN as a group, the policy decision on South China Sea. China does try to wage, exploiting Laos and Cambodia, for example, who do not have a direct stake on South China Sea, to have position that more coincide, overlap with China's. So that is the first type. I think that's quite natural. The second type, 5G and digital connectivity issue. This is a decision at the national level. Bilateral relations, not collective. So China might want to wage, but individual ASEAN countries, individual Southeast Asian states make our own decision. So China does not really have the room to wage. But China, what it's doing, it's, you can say, counter hedging whatsoever. China does try to win over countries who are excluding China in the earlier rounds and never give up, try to persuade by many means. Because of time, I can only very quickly share two examples, right? One is Malaysia, and then the other one is Singapore. Malaysia, despite the light hedging approach, earlier round under, and that's Professor Lee's question, whether government change, policy change or not. The answer is yes. Not always, but the chances are higher. So in the case of Malaysia, we did have a few rounds of government changes, unfortunately. So earlier government, Mohini government, made the decision of choosing Ericsson. Yeah, there was a time we had the workshop early on, choosing Ericsson over Huawei. But there was a commercial decision because of Ericsson offer much better package. It's not because of politics or geopolitics. And now, fast forward to today, under different government, Anwar Ibrahim government. Anwar Ibrahim is perceived as someone very close to US, right? He made the decision recently by allowing the second network and saying openly that this second network that is going to open next year, meaning next month and onwards, would allow Huawei to take part. So meaning that we are now, Malaysian government is now taking actions, political change to allow for so-called quote-unquote technological neutrality, right? Technological neutrality of trying to make decisions that allow smaller countries, us in Southeast Asia, to send signal to both competing powers, US and China, that when we make decisions, those are specific, not across the board, so nothing personal. So Malaysian government is one case. Another example would be the case that Singapore's decision, as I mentioned earlier on, of choosing 2 from US-backed company, 2 from Chinese-backed company for the data center. So examples can go on, but fundamentally, I think hedging means that it's not permanent. We know it has its own problems, but countries' governments will adjust accordingly as the level of threat evolve, as the level of alliance support evolve. We do not have crystal ball, but we do know that if our theory is anything to go by, these 2 conditions will determine whether, when, and for how long hedging will evolve, either for digital connectivity or other interstate cooperation issues. Thank you.
Yeah, Cheng-Chwee, so your theory of hedging is getting better and better, huh? Yeah, so thank you, Professor Lee, for your insightful comments and questions. Professor Lee always touches upon the fundamental issues rather than detailed or specific issues. And then, actually, his question and comments always push me to think more thoroughly, to come up with the more refined ideas and sophisticated methods. But I think his questions are somehow actually related to each other, so I would like to lump them together to answer in a kind of the wholesale manner. The first one is that the conceptual issues, the differences between geoeconomics and economic security. Actually, according to the classic definition, by geoeconomics, you usually mean the country's mobilization of economic means to achieve foreign policy objectives. So in that regard, actually, the basic assumption is that there is a hierarchical relationship between the economy and security. Security as a goal and the economy or economic as a means. So, but point here is that in the age of the 21st century and in the age of the hyper uncertainty, actually the more important is that how to link the economy and security. In that regard, the linkage matters more than just how to mobilize the economic means to achieve the foreign policy objectives. In that regard, I would say the how to link the economy and security is the fundamental question we have to think about. In that regard, in my paper, I addressed some issues related to the differences between the tactical linkages and the substantive linkages. Actually, in my presentation, I stressed that in order to effectively link the economy and security, you need a nexus, right? Without nexus, it is almost equivalent to the economic coercion. That has to do with the tactical linkages. Actually, great powers attempt to link the economy and security without believing that they are really or practically linked together. But then why do they do that? They do try to attempt pursue the tactical linkages for the goal of the eliciting compromise or concession from the weaker countries. So in that regard, tactical linkage is more or less about the economic coercion. So we have to make a differentiation between the tactical and substantive linkages. And Professor Wang Hee Lee's question about South Korea's hedging or light hedging strategy, I have to confess that I'm a big fan of your theory. And then, but one thing I have to tell you is that, in my understanding, hedging should not be evaluated or assessed on the basis of the individual case. Rather, hedging is more or less a national strategy. We have to put them together, all the individual cases, and then to evaluate the hedging strategy as a national strategy. In that regard, many countries try to combine different policies, and sometimes many countries try to adopt different strategies with countervailing effects toward each other. So like the exclusive focus on one individual case may not enough to explain the nature of the hedging strategy at the national level. So correct me if I'm wrong. And yeah, Ryo's point, yeah, always important, like how is it, right? Yeah, in my presentation, I stressed that South Korea tries to take advantage of high technology as a means to pursue international cooperation with other countries, particularly like-minded countries. I think we have to understand the peculiar nature of the current situation, because like on the one hand, every country is indeed interested in nurturing endogenous industries, right? But at the same time, you have to stay inclusive as much as possible. Actually, in the past, usually industrial policy tends to exclusively focus on the nurturing the domestic companies and domestic industries. But this is the age of, again, the hyper uncertainty. You have to create the more inclusive ecosystem of high technologies. That's one of the reasons why you need international cooperation. On the one hand, you have to nurture and strengthen the industrial competitiveness of your own industry. At the same time, given that no single country can be fully autonomous on their own. So that's why you need cooperation. So on the one hand, like pursuit of technological sovereignty. On the other hand, you have to seek the inclusive international cooperation. This is not actually good matches in the normal days. But given that this is the age of hyper uncertainty, you have to combine those two countervailing or conflicting objectives into one national strategy or economic security strategy. In that regard, it's going to be a very challenging task, but that's the thing you have to address in the coming months and years. Yeah, let me stop it.
Thank you so much, Professor Sashi, for your very constructive and critical comments. And I know that you have a very thorough knowledge about the economic coercion. And in our the previous workshop, I actually got many good lessons from your presentation. So actually at the beginning you mentioned about we have to think about economic coercion from the big picture. I totally agree with that. And so this is kind of like the initial kind of like, how can I say, the scratch paper of the doing a new project. So I will thinking about, or I will try to embed that kind of a big picture in this paper. And you mentioned about the anti-economic coercion mechanism, which is discussed at the G7 level or the EU level. And actually, the Victor Cha actually arguing that we have to make kind of like a collective resilience by taking kind of a deterrence by punishment measure. But as you know, it is very costly and very difficult to maneuver collectively. So, for example, like at the policy level, when I have a chance to talk with the government officials, probably the very first step to make kind of the anti-coercive measure might be kind of information sharing between countries. So let's do kind of the early warning information sharing mechanism together. But then usually the government official said that actually it's not doable. Yeah, we cannot coerce the private actors to report their any kind of information to us, and usually the private sector worrying about the retaliation from the Chinese side. So it is very difficult to collect that kind of information. So even making that kind of information sharing is very difficult and impossible. Then how about making kind of let everybody knows that actually the China's the economic coercion shows very bad track record. So just let them know. Then that will be much easy way to develop the next step of the anti-coercion mechanism. That's my idea. And the third thing is about the Japanese case. Actually, you mentioned about the Abe's interview if you share that interview with me, then I will really appreciate that. And so you probably know my email address. So yeah, I was looking for your reply. And yeah, you're right. The Japanese case is a very outlier and exceptional case, and that is actually a very good candidate for the case study, the qualitative method, right? So this is the kind of like outlier. So by taking care of that kind of outlier seriously, then I think we can develop, or we can make some of the theoretical the contribution. And about the fourth thing about the ambiguity, actually, yeah, you mean that I know that actually the ambiguity might be a better the phrase to talking about the informality. Also, in here, actually, I did not define what's the how to define the 4 factors I use in this short paper. So at least I thought about that. The Chinese economic coercion is taking kind of happening in the gray zone, and it takes about like informal ways, but probably ambiguous or ambiguity might be a better term to capture the Chinese economic coercive behaviors. I would so thinking about it seriously in the later. And finally, you mentioned about the U.S. and U.S. is not reliable in dealing with the economic coercion. And the professor, the Carson also mentioned about is there any kind of the ways of dealing with the U.S. domestic uncertainty in each countries. So I think yeah, the U.S. might be a very important factor in dealing with these kind of things, and even in probably yeah, I do not have any specific answer for that, but when I developing the paper in the future, then I will also thinking about the implication of the U.S. Domestic uncertainty and more seriously. And actually, the Professor Chun Jae-sung also mentioned about whether China has been targeted economic coercion by other country. And in my understanding, actually, thanks to the asymmetric relations, the China is more exposed to the economic sanctions rather than economic coercions. So right now, we are witnessing the many different types of the sanctions on the semiconductor sectors to China. And main difference between the economic coercion and sanction might be it's a much more formal, and the rationales behind the sanction should be legal and rule-based. So at least because of the Chinese kind of like asymmetric relations and the big trade partner with the other countries, China usually tend to be exposed to the economic sanctions rather than the economic coercion. That's my understanding. Right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yesterday and today we dealt with 4 important issues, and I think economic security issues is also very important. So we addressed a lot of issues, had a very rich discussion, but I think there are a lot of challenges and tasks ahead. So I think we need to continue this discussion. We have focused on military security issues so far because we face a lot of military challenges from North Korea and from surrounding countries. But I think emerging issues will be very important. So I guess EAI and other colleagues will continue to have this kind of discussion. So please join me in thanking this excellent panelists today. Thank you.